Hi, everybody. Welcome back for week 3. We have finished identifying science in the museum to this point. So for this week 3, we are looking at defining progress, which is the second part of our unit. And so we're going to go ahead and jump right into that. Excuse me for my voice this week. I'm a little sick. So we want to start by looking at what we mean when we talk about the term progress in a broader sense, and then we'll get into specifically about science and technology in the museum. So when we're looking at progress, we're looking at the history of the term and why it's so important in terms of thinking about things that we're thinking about in this class. So it's useful for us to see how scholars have tended to look at progress. And progress plays a pretty central role in how we think about the history of the United States and the history of Western nations. John B. Bury is going to write in 1921 essentially a huge tome on the history of progress and how it operates in Western civilization. And he's going to say that this is the animating and controlling idea of these civilizations and their advancement over time, which means it has a central role, right, when we think about how we have become what we have become in this present day. When he's talking about progress, he's referring to it very broadly, which is one of the issues of talking about something like this, because progress, really broadly stated, is an improvement of the human condition over time. And implicit in that belief is that we start at a lower point where we're less progressive, right? And we end, or we are constantly moving into higher and higher points of progression. And that can mean a lot of different things, and it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, right? We can look at economic changes among nations, political changes among nations or regions, religious changes throughout the West. And then for the purposes of our class, right, we're looking at science and technology. There are certain key developments that we tend to associate with progression, in science and technology is one of them. So when we look at examples of display, we're going to see that progress is a narrative that tends to be used fairly often. This is a bit of a problematic way to look at the world, right? To say that we started at this lower point and we're always getting better, right? We're always advancing, right? That isn't necessarily historically accurate. There are times where we are advancing, or parts of whatever topic we're talking about where we are advancing, and parts of it where we're not, right? It's a complex sort of understanding, too complex for narratives of progress sometimes to get into. So that's why it's a topic worth exploring, especially when we look at science and technology, which is often used in a sort of utopian narrative. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding this as being a key theme of how science and technology is presented. When we look at how ideas of progress tend to be represented, when we recognize the narrative in this way, right, going from something lesser to something greater or improving constantly, there are components that we have to consider, usually in the display, right, which is what's going on currently or what has been going on in the recent past, how we would like to improve, and what we would like to achieve, right? So there's the method of improvement and whatever the end goal is that we have. So since we're primarily looking at science, right, and we are primarily looking at it from a museum based approach, we want to see how these narratives tend to play out in exhibits, which they tend to play out this way fairly often. So because we've already established in our timeline two kind of watershed moments in relation to society's relationship to technology and science, then we want to make sure that we're going to stay on that timeline. The readings that you're going to look at this week are primarily going to be Cold War focused, so I'm going to use the lecture today to focus on industrialization. This is going to help us track this longer history. We will look at some other time periods as we go forward from this point, but for this unit, we're going to stay on the timeline that we established in week 2. So the industrialization period, the 19th century for the most part, has some very clear ideas about progress that are tied to ideas of science and ideas of race. So this is something that probably most of you have heard about in some capacity from taking a survey level American history course or Western Civ course. But in the 19th century, right, a lot of ideas about civilization were tied to global interactions, a discovery of different races and peoples, and trying to understand their differences, right? And so in earlier centuries, a lot of ideas about race were tied to being savage or not being savage. And Western philosophers and scientists, right, start to try to uncover what it means to be civilized or what it doesn't mean to be civilized. And these become also tied to greater scientific development. So, big name, scientific advancement, Darwinism, evolution, then is used, right? It establishes the theory of evolution and then becomes tied to, through social Darwinism, although not approved by Darwin himself, right, to compare different races of people in this period. So a lot of scientists start to believe, right, that there was a beginning for every race around the world to start as barbaric or savage, but they evolved at different rates into becoming civilized nations, or civilized peoples. So they start to evaluate how that sort of thing develops, right? So we have examples like you see in the picture here on the right of phrenology, studying different, sizes of skulls and things like that to show why certain groups were more civilized and some were less civilized. But at the end of the day, these Western scientists, right, and scholars are going to believe that only white races had evolved to becoming civilized. So any person that is born into a white race is a civilized person by virtue of that entire race of people already becoming civilized. And the opposite becomes true for people who are not white, right? You're automatically born as a savage or barbaric person by virtue of your racial connection or your racial heritage. So these sorts of beliefs are used to justify a lot of relations and advancements across the world in this time period. So we're concerned with, when we're talking about science and technology and how these things become intertwined, in imperialism and how ideas are also imposed literally on the landscape. Science and reason become seen as central tenets of being a civilized nation or group of people, right? Western societies had focused their efforts on advancing science and reason through educational systems or through economic advancement. And so using science and reason and being more civilized naturally by this point than other races, these sorts of beliefs justified actions taken by peoples of these groups. So imperialism, right, colonization of other nations, growing empires from Western nations, right, used science and reason to essentially take over other areas for their own economic and social benefit. So there was a justification that because we were already advanced, right, people from these Western cultures, they could help other nations advance in Asia or in Africa or Latin America. But also in some cases, when we look at the social Darwinists, right, that also meant wiping out certain races of people, as was our right as a more advanced, right, civilization, right, the concept of survival of the fittest. So imperialistic actions became justified by science and reason and as part of a goal of progress. It's not just like, I guess this is something that has to happen, but something that we should be actively working towards, as is our our right and our role in society to continue to advance all of humanity forward, right? So This takes place in how we treat other people. It also takes place in how we treat the landscapes of these places that we're taking over. If we look at examples like conquering the West, manifest destiny, right? We take over these lands that were currently under the use of Native American tribes or by Mexican peoples, and we say, you're not really using, scientific advancement in to the point that Western societies had discovered to cultivate and mine the land for resources, right? So we have new advancements in, say, commercial farming or mining, that use the land in ways that these other societies were not, right? And we see this again as another example or a justification of the things that we have created in these Western societies. On the other side of this, if we are looking once again at human relations on the landscape, even things like parkland represent that sort of development. Parks, public parks essentially, were civilizing institutions at this time. They hired people to run the parks and essentially tell people how to act and show people how to act to be better citizens. So on both cases, we have these beliefs intertwining. One of the best examples of seeing how these beliefs operated in a museum sort of context is to look at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which is better known as the 1893 World's Fair. If you read the book Devil in the White City, it talks about this development. So what we see in the White City, right, is all of these ideas and how they are intertwined with one another. So people study this particular fair to really understand how social, economic, racial, science, and technology, all of these things were relating to one another in this society. If you look at the example or these photos that you see below, right, you see that there were two parts to the World's Fair in Chicago. There was the main fairgrounds, which was known as the White City, which had a very Western neoclassical design, compared to the Midway, which is where they put all the non-white, savage, barbarous races in a kind of amusement park-like atmosphere just outside of the fair, and there was a strict separation between these two things. As Gail Biederman notes, this is essentially a lesson in understanding racial hierarchy in American society and in Western society at this time. The White City is going to use electric lighting, as we see in the picture on the left, to showcase technological development. And this neoclassical design style, there's all these different buildings dedicated to technological advancements in the West. And then you're going to, right next door to it, see these people who are brought in essentially to be gawked at for their exotic and savage ways. So they, in some cases, literally imported people to show off. One of the ways in which this sort of relationship has been described is as a human zoo, essentially. So you had people from all these different non-Western countries that are just brought in as entertainment on the Midway, and it's a very, very different atmosphere. It's a carnival-like atmosphere in which they're living essentially for these months that they're brought in for the fair, and in some cases they're also actors, but you can tell in these pictures, right? There's a very different sort of relationship going on. The key point that I want to get across here is that what the fair showed is how all of these things were intertwined and how progress was a key point that had impacts on racial relations, and how technology and science was used in a key way to showcase what advancement was and what savagery was, right? Civilization was electricity and certain styles of architecture, these really grand accomplishments that we would tie to the United States, whereas all of these exotic peoples, right, were seen as a comparison point of everything that was lesser, right, and everything that represents the past and either needs to be reformed or done away with, right, to ensure our own advancement forward. So when you look at the Cold War period, you want to think about a similar sort of thing, is how does this relationship operate between how technology and science is used to push certain ideas of what it means to be progressing forward as a nation or as a people, and who gets included in that narrative and who gets left to the wayside, essentially. So I want to really briefly here finish us up by talking about the assignment that's due at the end of this week. Make sure that you do it a short answer sort of approach. It is basically us putting together everything that we've learned in Module 1, nothing to do with your final paper or your final project. It's about making sure that I know that you know the history of science-based museums and you know the role that progress plays in exhibit narratives. Don't do any outside research. Just use stuff from class. Make sure you use Alexander and Alexander because it's in the question. If you have any questions about anything from this week, please send me an email and I will get back to you as soon as possible. I will see you next week for Module 2.